For some people who've had serious epilepsy that can't be treated with drugs, they'll do a desperate surgery where they take off the top of your skull, literally cut it off like you're with a saw, go in there with a knife, and there's a band of fibers called the corpus callosum, about 220 million fibers that connect the left and right hemisphere. They go in there and they cut with a knife that band of fibers. And that effectively disconnects much of the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. And what you find is you can actually have you reveal two separate personalities with two separate contents of consciousness. You can have, in some cases, the left hemisphere of one guy, he wanted to be a draftsman, and the right hemisphere wanted to be a race car driver. Left hemisphere in one person believed in God, the right hemisphere was an atheist. They have different personalities, different career goals, different likes and dislikes, and you can have them perceiving different things at the same time. You can set up a situation where the left hemisphere is aware of the word ring, and the right hemisphere is aware of the word key, and there's no one that's aware of key and ring together. So they can have separate consciousnesses. So there's two conscious agents in me, and then I'm proposing it goes all the way. That's just the beginning. So I'm not just one agent, I'm two, but I'm not just two, I'm many that interact. So those two combine to create the one that I call me, but there's many agents that combine to create the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere and so forth.
Hello, Don. Welcome to the Rion Talks podcast. Great having you here.
Thanks for having me, Antonio.
I really want to get into the hard problem of consciousness with you today. But before we get into that, would you mind giving us a brief summary of what you do and how you initially got interested in consciousness?
Yes, I've studied visual perception. How is it that we see in 3D, see objects in colors and recognize objects? I've studied that also from an evolutionary perception or perspective. So sensory systems are shaped by evolution, by natural selection. Would natural selection shape our sensory systems or any sensory systems to show us the truth about reality or not? To what extent would evolution favor creatures that see reality as it is, at least some aspects of reality? So I've studied that a little bit. And I've been studying consciousness as well, which is one of the interesting open problems in cognitive neuroscience, and it's been a philosophical problem for centuries, which is how are our conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate or a headache or seeing the color red, how are these related to physical processes, perhaps like neural processes in the brain? So I've been a professor at the University of California in the cognitive science department. I'm now professor emeritus. I am just retired from the university back in July of 2020. So I've got more time to think. And so that's what I've been up to.
Great. I've heard you say again and again that the probability that what we're seeing is reality is very close to 0%. Why is that?
So the context in which I say that is just looking at one of our best confirmed scientific theories, evolution by natural selection. And as a scientist, I don't know which theories are true or not. I don't know if our best scientific theories are true or not. If I had to bet, I would bet that we will have better theories in the future, so that our current theories, as remarkable as they are not the final word, and they will be guides to future theories. But as a scientist, what I've got to do, at least one thing that is responsible for me to do as a scientist right now, is to take our best current theories and see what they entail. And that's what I and my colleagues, Chetan Prakash and others, Brian Marion, Justin Mark, and others that I've been working with, have been doing. We're looking at the specific question: does natural selection favor creatures whose sensory systems report true structures of objective reality? Now, the question is not do those sensory systems get favored that report all of objective reality. No one would think that we see all of objective reality. But the question is really, for a creature, would natural selection favor sensory systems that report at least those aspects of reality, those structural aspects of reality that are critical to survival in that niche? And most of us have the intuition that the answer is, of course, that's the case, right? I mean, surely it must be that if you see those aspects of reality that are important in your niche, you will be more fit and will be more likely to pass on your genes to the next generation, namely the genes that code for seeing those aspects of reality. So that seems like, why bother? It's just obviously true. And I think a lot of my colleagues have just assumed that it's obviously true, with some notable exceptions, like Steven Pinker, for example, who really knows evolutionary theory quite well. In fact, his work has been very influential on my own study of evolution and perception. But most of my colleagues would say it's just sort of obvious that not only humans, but any creatures would be adapted to see at least those aspects of reality that are critical in their niche. But it turns out we don't have to wave our hands. There's evolutionary game theory. John Maynard Smith, a mathematician in the 1970s, roughly figured out how to use that mathematics of game theory to turn natural selection into a mathematically precise theory. So I did simulations with my graduate students, Justin Mark and Brian Marion, and the bottom line was we found evidence that the creatures that saw reality as it is weren't winning when they competed with equally complex creatures that saw none of reality and were just having their senses tuned to fitness. And then I went, armed with those results, I went and got a mathematician friend of mine, Chetan Prakash, to work on it. We worked together, but he's the mathematician, not me. And he proved a theorem, and we published it together, that it's a theorem of the theory of evolution of natural selection, that the probability is zero, that any sensory system of any creature in any niche will ever be shaped to see any structure of objective reality. And an obvious objection that comes up in people's minds when I say something like that, because it's such a strong claim, that evolution will never let any creature see any aspect of the structure of objective reality. How could you possibly say that unless you knew what the structure of objective reality was, and then so that you could show that we weren't seeing that structure? And that's the power of mathematics and this, is that you can show that whatever the structure might be, it doesn't matter, you won't see it. And so that's why this is one of the reasons why it's a non-trivial result. So again, I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is the final word. It's the best word we've got so far. I'm studying it because there are no other contenders right now in science that can explain the rich variety of data that can be explained by evolution by natural selection. Doesn't mean that theory is the final word, or that is in some sense deeply right, but it does mean that the only responsible position we can take right now is to study our current best theory and then try to figure out what a new theory might be that explains everything that natural selection explains plus more. We don't want less. We want a theory that explains more. So if anybody's got another theory that they want to put out there, great, but the bar is high. You have to explain everything that natural selection explains plus more. Good luck.
So what I'm understanding here is that we are evolved in order to have fitness gains, not to see reality.
That's right. That's right. And so an example of that just intuitively would be just if you're playing a video game, right? If you're playing a video game, say, I like to use the example of, say, a car racing game, maybe Grand Theft Auto or something like that, but maybe souped up to be a virtual reality multiplayer kind of thing. In that case, I mean, the world that you're directly seeing, in which you see, a red Ferrari and a green Mustang, and you see a steering wheel and gas pedal and brakes and so forth, the dashboard on your ride. All of that, of course, is just a virtual reality. It's in that whole setup, in that metaphor, the reality would be some supercomputer somewhere that you don't see. So it's really diodes and resistors, voltages and magnetic fields, and some supercomputer. That's the reality that all the players in this multiplayer game are interacting with. But They could be 8-year-old kids. They have no idea what voltages and magnetic fields are. Even if you told them, they couldn't understand, and they can play the game. So what they're doing is they're using this VR interface, which is all, eye candy, red Mustangs or whatever it might be, and steering wheels. They're using all this eye candy to control a really complicated reality that they maybe couldn't understand or don't believe in. And they don't need to know about it to actually master the game. And conversely, suppose you know about the reality and you can actually toggle the voltages in the computer. So you can actually, in some sense, manipulate reality directly. Could you beat someone in Grand Theft Auto who's actually just using the interface? I doubt it. Toggle as fast as you can. You're not going to be able to win the game. And so that gives you an intuition about what's going on with evolution. Essentially, it's given us perceptions of space and time and objects like cars and trees, the moon, your own body, your face. These are all just icons. Even your own body, your own face is just an icon in a virtual reality that's been evolved by natural selection from this point of view, and is there to hide the truth. You don't need to know the truth to play the game of life successfully, which in this case, is living long enough to reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation is the story in evolution by natural selection. And so just like in the video game, to play the game, you don't need to know reality. In the same thing in life, to play the game of life, in other words, living long enough to reproduce, is you don't need to know the truth. And so evolution gave us senses that we have to take seriously, right? They're there to keep us alive long enough to reproduce. And then they dump you. Right? That's why we get old and get cancer and so forth as we get older, right? You've gone past the time of reproduction and there's no selection pressures to keep you alive. But so they're there to keep you alive and win the game, but not to show you the truth. But we have to take them seriously because they are there to keep us alive. And we've been programmed by natural selection to just assume that they're literally true. We get programmed before we're of reason, at the age of reason, to even argue about it. By the time we're about 4 months of age, child psychologists have discovered, we get saddled with the belief that they call object permanence. Objects really exist. What I see is the truth, and it's there even when I don't look. So we're evolution. It's really done a number on us. But the number was just to let us play the game of life successfully long enough to reproduce. So it gave us a virtual reality that's not the truth. It's completely the very language of space and time and physical objects, like neurons and brains, is the wrong language. You could not. It's not like you get the shape of that apple a little bit wrong or the distance to that rock a little bit off. I'm saying something much, much deeper. I'm saying the very language of space and time and objects and colors and shapes is the wrong language. You could not use that language to form any true statements about objective reality. It's the wrong language. Can't be done. So evolution gave us the wrong language for the truth, but the right language for perceptions that guide actions that keep us alive. And then it saddled us at about 4 months of age, and from then on, with the deeply held belief that we're seeing the truth. And so even very, very smart scientists, it's very hard to shake that belief. You've had it since you were 4 months old. You've never questioned it. And science has worked so well for the last few centuries on the assumption that space and time is fundamental, that physical objects are fundamental. So science has been extremely successful so far. And so there's been very little impetus for us to question this until recently. With new advances in physics and so forth, we're realizing we do have to let go.
Not only what really struck at home for me was that we have different VR goggles than other species that see an additional color or that have a better sense of smell and can hear further. So why do you think us as humans, we thought that our perception or our VR was the closest one to objective reality prior to these findings?
Well, I think it's a sort of a parochialism on our part, right? We're pre-programmed by evolution to just assume that we're seeing reality as it is. We have our most insight into other humans. We have less insight into other animals, right? We have very much less insight. I have some insight into my cat, but not as much as into my brother or sister, or spouse or parents, and much less insight into the world of an ant. We have to really study them carefully, to understand their world, and so it's very easy for us to assume that we're superior, right? We understand them less. They don't look to be acting that intelligently from our point of view. But you could also then wonder, it might be the case that all creatures just assume that they're the peak. It's sort of that there's no reason for an ant. I mean, ants have no idea about us. In fact, every once in a while I get bitten by it. As far as an ant's concerned, I'm just a chunk of meat, and a stupid chunk of meat, and I'm just food. And so from an ant's point of view, I'm not more exalted than it. I'm just a chunk of meat to eat. And same thing for a lot of creatures. So it may be just a standard mistake that many creatures make, just to assume, to the extent that they're consciously making assumptions at all, that it might be just an unconscious bias that sort of pervades how their whole world is. That this is the truth, and boy, as far as I can tell, I'm the smartest thing around. So it may be that we're just another species that's high in itself for no good reason.
And before you mentioned that we're not even seeing space, time, and everything that we know now is not even in the right language to try and decode the mystery that's actually going on. So what do you say that language is coded on?
Right. So again, and I should say that when I say that, I'm not saying that I'm sure that that's true. All I'm saying is I'm sure that that's what evolution by natural selection entails. So there may be a deeper point of view in which it is possible for humans and other creatures to have true perceptions. So you can see the subtlety here. I'm not flat out denying that we might perceive reality as it is. I'm just saying that if you assume that we see reality as it is, that contradicts evolution by natural selection. So we have a little conflict there that has to be understood. Now, there may be a deeper point of view and a deeper theory in which it's possible for us to have true perceptions. Again, maybe not exhaustively true, but true. And it may be from that deeper theory we could show how space and time and evolution by natural selection within space and time are a special projection of this deeper theory. And why it's a theorem of natural selection that you can't see the truth, but that from a deeper point of view, you can understand that we can see the truth, and why natural selection would say we couldn't. So for example, suppose that it's the case that if all you know is the language of the pixels and objects in Grand Theft Auto, that you don't have the right language to talk about the truth in that metaphor, namely the voltages and magnetic field. You just have, but there is so if you developed a theory of reality just within the language of Grand Theft Auto, you could probably prove a theorem that you couldn't see anything outside the realm of Grand Theft Auto, for example. But there is a deeper language and a deeper theory in which you can talk about diodes and resistors and magnetic fields and games programmed, and you could say, well, within a deeper framework, I understand where Grand Theft Auto comes from and why you can't see outside the headset if you only use Grand Theft Auto. I mean, it's stuck in the headset. And so that's what's going on here. Science has been spectacularly successful for hundreds of years now at studying our headset. Space-time is our headset. And what we've discovered is our headset is beautifully structured. And by studying the headset, we can get incredible power. It's very much like someone becoming really good at a video game. If you become a master of the game, right, you know all the tricks. You've really studied how the game works. So science has figured out, using mathematics and careful experiments and deep thought, we've been able to understand a lot about how the headset works, and we can do miraculous things now. Just like someone who's a genius at Grand Theft Auto, to a neophyte, what they can do in the game seems miraculous, right? But that's just knowing the headset and how it works. What if you actually knew the software that was programming the headset, and you could actually change the parameters in the software? And so there's a sense in which knowing the reality could actually be a big, big help. So you got some wizard who's beating everybody, and you could just do this. And say, well, I'm just going to give him a flat tire, or I'm going to take all the gas out of his tank. I mean, there's all sorts of things you could do instead of actually playing the game the standard way and trying to beat him at his own game. You just take the air out of his tires, literally, and so that's the kind of thing that science is now starting to do. Physics and science more generally has been about what happens inside space and time, or space-time since Einstein. And that's been really successful, but space-time is just our headset. It's not objective reality. And we can talk about why physicists are saying that now if you're interested. But that's what physicists are coming to. They're saying space-time is...
Why is it doomed?
Why is it doomed?
Yeah.
Well, there's two good thought experiments that they're more than thought experiments. They're implications of modern physical theory that really spell this out. So I'll do the easier one first. The easier one. Suppose that you're trying to look at something at smaller and smaller scale. Like you want to get a microscope out and look at an ant, and then look at just the leg of an ant, and then a little hair on the leg, and then a molecule, and so forth. So you're going to have to use higher and higher resolution. What does that mean? Well, if you're using light, intuitively, you have to use light with smaller and smaller wavelengths, right? Because you need smaller wavelengths of light to resolve the smaller structures that you're looking at. If your wavelength of light was that wide, and you're trying to look at a microscopic thing in an ant, good luck, you won't see any details at all. Well, quantum theory tells us that as you look with light that has smaller and smaller wavelengths, the energy is going up and up. So this is a big, big discovery, that the energy of light is proportional to its wavelength, so as the wavelength gets smaller, the energy of the light goes up. So blue light has higher energy than red light. Blue light has smaller wavelengths than red light. It's actually, and that's, you can actually get hurt by ultraviolet light. It's very, very powerful. It can burn you. Whereas, so that's just intuition. So that's no problem in principle. If all we had was quantum theory around, we could just use smaller and smaller wavelengths and probe to whatever small scale we want. But when you bring gravity in, there's a problem, because Einstein tells us that energy and mass are the same thing, E equals mc squared. And if you get too much mass in too small a spot, you create a black hole. And so what happens is that you're going great, you're looking smaller and smaller, and all of a sudden you're trying to go to the next step and look smaller, and all of a sudden the thing that you're studying disappears and a black hole forms. And if you get a little upset and say, you try harder, you add more energy, you just make a bigger black hole. So what we find is that you can't even make sense of the notion of space-time beyond a certain scale. The scale is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Beyond that, it's not that there are like little pixels of space-time. That's not the right idea, according to most physicists. That's the wrong idea, because that would not be what they call Lorentz invariant. So that's just wrong. It would violate Einstein's special relativity requirement of Lorentz invariance. It just means that space-time itself ceases to be a coherent notion. Space-time is doomed. The very The very language of space-time ceases to be operationally well-defined. But it's not just about small. So that was the first one, quantum theory and gravity. But quantum theory and gravity make another problem, even for a big room, not just when you go to small stuff, but even in a big room. So take any big-sized room that you want, and suppose that you're trying to measure something, like some property, a coupling property of electron or something like that, or some ratio of masses of electrons to other particles. So quantum theory tells you that you're going to do this in a room. So you need a measuring apparatus, and you need the electron or whatever it is you're measuring. And the quantum theory says the measuring apparatus itself is also a quantum system. So it has quantum degrees of freedom and so forth. And it's subject to the so-called Heisenberg uncertainty principle, just like the system that you're looking at. Heisenberg says you can't measure position and momentum absolutely precisely at the same time. There's an uncertainty there. And so to reduce the uncertainty in whatever you're measuring, in quantum theory, you only can measure probabilities for outcomes. And so you have to do lots of measurements to get finer and finer probabilities, right? You flip a coin once, you don't know if it's fair. If you flip a coin 1,000 times and comes up with roughly 500 heads, you have a pretty good idea it's a fair coin. But if you flip it 1,000 times, it comes up with only 300 heads, you know something's probably afoot there. Someone's cheating on you, right? So in quantum theory, you have that. You have to do the experiment many, many times, more times to get more accuracy. But also the apparatus, and this is what a lot of people don't know, the apparatus itself needs to have more and more degrees of freedom to make a finer and finer measurement on the electron. Otherwise, you won't have the precision that you need for your measurement. Well, once again, you're going to have the problem is the apparatus gets more and more degrees of freedom. It's getting bigger and bigger, more mass. And so at some point, you're doing the experiment and the whole room collapses into a black hole as you try to get more precision. So this is no longer about the very, very tiny thing about space. It's saying something really profound. It's saying that when you bring quantum theory and gravity together, they tell us that there is nothing that can be precisely observed in space-time. Nothing. The way they put it is there are no local observables in space-time. And that is truly stunning. That's another way of saying space-time is doomed. There is nothing in our space-time, our so-called de Sitter space-time that we live in, and where our universe is expanding and accelerating, there is literally no precise observable anywhere in space-time. So that's an even more profound reason why space-time is doomed. It's not just at the tiny little thing where space-time seems to make no sense. At the macroscopic scale, space-time doesn't make sense. There's nothing that we can observe in space-time precisely. So that's the deeper reason.
Wow. And how does space-time being doomed connect to the theory that you have with conscious realism?
Right. So, and by the way, if people want to actually, I'm a cognitive scientist, people might go, it's one thing for cognitive scientists to be saying all this, who's a physicist that I can go check on this? So if people are interested and they want to actually get it from an authority, I would suggest people go online to and look up Nima, Nima, first name, and the last name is Arkani Hamed, Arkani -Hamed. He's a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He's got a bunch of lectures online, including some for non-technical audiences, and you can go and hear it from the horse's mouth why space-time is doomed. So don't take it from me, take it from a real expert. That space-time is doomed. So the reason I go there as well is because evolution by natural selection agrees. The very predicates of space and time, the language of space and time, cannot describe objective reality. So space-time is doomed from an evolutionary point of view. So evolution by natural selection agrees with quantum theory and gravity that space-time has had a good run, but it's over. The reason it's had a good run is because it's our headset. We've been studying our headset, and we needed to do that. We needed to study our headset, but it's just a headset. And then your question was, so why does that lead me to conscious realism? Well, it leads me to what I call conscious realism for the following reason. One of the biggest unsolved problems in science for quite a while has been, how is consciousness related to the physical world? And by consciousness, I don't necessarily mean anything really abstract or exalted, like, self-awareness or high states of consciousness. I'm thinking something simple like a rat smelling cheese. And so it's something, a sensory experience I would imagine a rat has, or me having a headache, or you having an itch on your shoulder. I mean, these are just raw sensory experiences that don't require great intelligence or exalted understanding or anything like that. That's the problem of consciousness comes in right there. How is an itch, the experience of an itch that I presume my cat has when it goes and scratches itself, how is that experience of an itch related to, say, the neural activity in the brain of the cat? And we know that there are correlations between brain activity and conscious experiences. And there's no doubt about that. And I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. Many of my colleagues are at the forefront of studying those. I mean, so just concretely, if I take a magnet that can inhibit brain activity, I just touch it to my skull and turn on the magnet. It's called a TMS unit, transcranial magnetic stimulation unit. We can actually inhibit parts of the cortex that are right next to the magnet, just through your skull. And if we do that right about here, area V4, say in the left hemisphere, you will immediately lose all color experience in the right visual field. You just see the color drain away, and it's like a black and white television seen on the right side of the world, but color on the left. You take the magnet away, and the color comes back. And there are hundreds of examples of these correlations. But we have no scientific theory to date. Despite great work by many of my colleagues and friends who are brilliant, there's not one mathematically precise theory that can explain even one specific conscious experience, like the taste of chocolate or the feeling of an itch. They can't say that this is the neural activity that causes, and this is precisely why it must cause it. So here's how that relates to the headset. I'm saying the reason we can't figure out how brain activity causes consciousness is because brains and neurons are just an icon in our headset. So they can't cause anything. In Grand Theft Auto, when you're playing the game, when I hold the steering wheel, it's a useful fiction to say that when I turn the steering wheel, that causes my car to change. Perfectly fine fiction, and for playing the game is perfectly fine. But it's not true, right? It's deeply not true. What's really causing pixels to change on your screen is this whole interaction with the supercomputer that you don't even know about. The steering wheel is just an icon, and it really causes nothing. Same thing with neurons. So I'll be very blunt about it. Neurons and brains are simply icons on our interface. They have no causal powers whatsoever. Brains cause none of our perceptions, none of our conscious experiences, and none of our actions. Now, for everyday neuroscience, when I'm actually talking about color perception and so forth, I will talk about V4, area V4 of cortex, causing color perception and so forth. Just like in Grand Theft Auto, I'd say, if I turn the steering wheel, that causes my car to go to the left. It's perfectly harmless for everyday work and for playing the game. And for everyday neuroscience, it's perfectly harmless fiction to think and talk as though neurons have any causal powers. But strictly speaking, they don't. And that only comes back to bite you when you want to do certain things. For playing the game, the fiction about the steering wheel is no problem. It won't hurt you. But if you're a software engineer and you want to change the game, if you really believe that the causal power was in the steering wheel, you have a lot to learn before you're going to be ready to do the software reboot that you need to change the game. And that's the attitude I have about consciousness. It's been perfectly fine for everyday neuroscience to think that neurons are real, even when they're not perceived, and have causal powers. That's perfectly fine. But for consciousness, now you're looking behind the hood. You're looking deeper. You're outside the headset, and now that fiction is no longer harmless. It's actually the thing that prevents us from understanding how consciousness works. And that's why, now, I'm not saying that logically, therefore, entails that I'm right about conscious realism, that consciousness might be fundamental. Absolutely not. More important than any particular theory that I might propose is the scientific attitude that guides all scientists. And that is that the scientific attitude really is that our theories are the best ideas that we've got so far. That does not mean that they're true. In fact, we should be working as hard as we can, pushing on them, pushing them to their limits, trying to break them. If we're sitting complacently, happy that with our theories and saying we can't do any better, we will never move forward. So the right attitude is, number one, of course, you have to first understand the theories, right? The theories that science has are spectacular. I mean, I love evolution by natural selection. I love what I understand about, Einstein's theories and quantum theory. They're beautiful theories. They're triumphs of human reason. They're really incredible. So it's not out of disrespect that we're trying to break the theories. It's rather out of deep respect. These things are so well developed. They encapsulate the ideas and hard work of thousands of the most brilliant human beings that have ever lived and have worked really hard. They've given us this incredible gift. And of course, it's our job to study it first and then break it and get the next step, which of course they would want as well. What's the next step? What's the deeper insight? So the idea is science has given us these beautiful theories. They're theories of our headset. To understand consciousness, I'm proposing, and of course I'm probably wrong, but that's how you play the science game. You go bold, go precisely so that you can figure out where you're wrong, and then see what happens. So I'm proposing that the step out of the headset is to assume that consciousness is fundamental, get a model of consciousness on its own terms, so model consciousness with mathematics, and then show that what we call space and time is, and all of what we thought was the final reality is just our headset that we use as a visualization tool. And by that I mean the following. So I'm proposing that reality and consciousness is like Twitterverse, right? It's a big social network, right? There's tens of millions of Twitter users, billions of tweets. There's no way that you could ever interact with all the users or read all the tweets. But if you want to see what's trending in Spain versus California, what's happening in your city versus, Cairo, you want a visualization tool that sort of takes all the incredible social data, the tens of millions of users, everything that they're tweeting, sort of distills it into something that you can understand, and that lets you see what's trending in Mallorca versus what's trending in Los Angeles, or down to a single house. Maybe you can see what this particular Twitter user is doing, and then zoom back out to all of the United States or something like that. So we need a visualization tool for overwhelming social data. That's what I propose space-time is. So physics, space-time, everything that science has done has been studying our visualization tool. But we're visualizing something that's non-physical. It's consciousness. And so there's a whole new scientific framework. The framework is going to use network information theory, the kind of mathematics that we use to understand the internet, for example, and social interactions and social media. This fairly new language that we've really been using in the last few decades as the internet has come online, and as social psychology has become more sophisticated mathematically, is the right language to study this new proposal that I've got of reality being a vast social network of interacting conscious agents. So that's sort of the top level my proposal. And we'll see. What I have to do, and what I'm working on right now, is to model the dynamics of consciousness. What is consciousness up to? What does the dynamics look like?
How do you model that? How do you model consciousness?
Well, I've got a paper. If people want to see the details, it's called Objects of Consciousness. So if people just Google Donald Hoffman, Objects of Consciousness, they can actually see the math. But the idea, if I actually went into all the details, it would be another couple hours. But just top level, what the idea is about is that there's so many things that we want a theory about consciousness to deal with. Consciousness has lots of aspects to it. There's self-awareness. There's the notion of a self. There's learning, memory, problem solving, There's conscious experience, there's action, there's free will, there's moral, and there's a huge laundry list that you want to come out of a theory of consciousness. What we want to do as scientists is find some smallest starting point. The minimal starting point. For me and my colleagues, we've picked that there are conscious experiences like having an itch, nothing exalted, just raw conscious experiences and simple decisions based on those experiences. And we've mathematically formalized that notion in terms of measurable structures and Markovian kernels. So there's that, the mathematics is involved in that. And what we get is network dynamics, very much like the dynamics you get when you're trying to model the internet, for example, and seeing how information travels over the net using probabilistic models, Markovian kernels, which are like communication channels, the mathematics of communication channels. So it's that kind of mathematics. And then what we try to do is to show how space-time emerges as a visualization tool. So this, you can see where this is going to go. Instead of saying that space-time and quantum mechanics and general relativity are fundamental, we're going to say, no, there's this deep world, this social network of conscious agents that's mathematically modeled. Only the long-term behavior of that, what we call the asymptotic behavior, is going to get projected into your headset, right? You're not going to see most of the time everything, all the detailed tweets that are going on in Mallorca. You're going to see just what's trending. You're going to see the long-term kinds of things that are going on. That's what a visualization tool does. And so what's going to happen is that we'll take all the step-by-step dynamics of consciousness, look at the long-term trends, the asymptotic behavior, and show how those get mapped into what we call space-time. In other words, I'm trying to reverse engineer space-time. I'm trying to show what's behind the hood, what's behind the headset. If we can reverse engineer space-time, then we can play with space-time. Just like if you know the software behind your interface, you can take the gas out of the tank of the wizard that's driving the car. We should be able to do that. So the idea is that space-time emerges as a visualization tool for a much deeper network information theoretic dynamics. To show that is not a hand wave. We have to actually show, for example, how to start with dynamics of conscious agents and predict gluon scattering at the Large Hadron Collider. Precise scattering amplitudes and precise predictions. That's what I'm up to right now, is working on that precise thing to show how space-time and modern physics arises precisely, numerically precisely, to n decimal places from this deeper theory of consciousness. That's my goal. So it's a very ambitious thing. And by the way, if I can't do that, then I'm not even wrong, right? If I can do it, it doesn't mean I'm right. It's just because I can do it doesn't mean I'm right. But if I can't do it, it means I'm not even wrong. It's not even worth paying attention to. So that's the standard of science, right? It's one thing to wave your hand and say that, consciousness is fundamental and space-time is just emergent. That's just a hand wave. When you can predict scattering amplitudes, at least now you've risen to the dignity where you might actually be wrong. Until then, you weren't even wrong. But I want to get to the point where I could be wrong. So I'm working on that with my colleagues. We're trying to get to the point where we might be wrong, but then we might actually be right too. But until then, there's nothing on the table. So that's what I'm working on. I'm studying physics and trying to show how physics in detail would arise from a projection of this deeper.
So would it be, do we start with one consciousness, and then how does that one consciousness then go on to create the other conscious agents and then go on to create space-time? How are you guys modeling that?
Well, it's very interesting that the mathematics is giving us some insights here that when conscious agents interact, they can create new conscious agents. And so this seems to be a really interesting dynamical evolutionary kind of process in which agents are interacting, and creating new agents. And
a conscious agent would be like, what would be a conscious agent specifically?
Well, so for example, I'm a conscious agent, but I'm also two conscious agents. And you can see this sometimes when we do split brain surgeries. So, you have two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere in your brain. And for some people who've had serious epilepsy that can't be treated with drugs, they'll do a desperate surgery where they take off the top of your skull, literally cut it off like you're with a saw, go in there with a knife, and there's a band of fibers called the corpus callosum, about 220 million fibers that connect the left and right hemisphere. They go in there and they cut with a knife that band of fibers. And that effectively disconnects much of the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. And what you find is you can actually have you reveal two separate personalities with two separate contents of consciousness. You can have, in some cases, the left hemisphere of one guy, he wanted to be a draftsman, and the right hemisphere wanted to be a race car driver. Left hemisphere and one person believed in God, the right hemisphere was an atheist. They have different personalities, different career goals, different likes and dislikes, and you can have them perceiving different things at the same time. You can set up a situation where the left hemisphere is aware of the word ring, and the right hemisphere is aware of the word key, and there's no one that's aware of key and ring together. So they can have separate consciousnesses. So there's two conscious agents in me, and then I'm proposing it goes all the way. That's just the beginning. So I'm not just one agent, I'm two, but I'm not just two, I'm many that interact. So those two combine to create the one that I call me, but there's many agents that combine to create the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere and so forth.
So when you say conscious agents interact, would us having a conversation mean that another conscious agent is created?
That's one interesting thing that comes out of this, is that conscious agents could emerge in ways that the lower level conscious agents aren't aware. Right? So there could be a conscious agent that emerges from the interactions of people, or just conscious agents, but people are conscious agents. So we could be creating conscious agents. So suppose you're married to somebody. You spend a lot of time with them. There is perhaps some new unit, some new entity that is being created. This actually, and it's an interesting question. In a brief interaction, what kind of entities are created? Are they ephemeral? Are they? So that's one thing I'm very interested. I don't have strong intuition, so I'm gonna have to go with the math on that one, right? I'll have to look what the mathematics says on that. But one thing that really comes out of this is the question: if consciousness is doing something, if there's a dynamics of consciousness, why? What is it about? Why should consciousness be doing something? What is it about, right? In other words, there's a deep question here, and the answer, and that might be like one of the deepest questions we could ask, right? If consciousness is fundamental, then one of the deepest questions we could ask is, what the hell is it up to? Why is it doing it, right? And the answer is, I don't know, but I've only seen one idea so far that's deep enough to be a candidate. And it comes from something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel was a logician who came up with this theorem when he was in his 20s or 30, around 1930. He proved, it's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. He proved effectively that there's no end to mathematical structure. No matter how much mathematical structure you discover, you've only just begun. And this in principle can never end. In some sense, even God, whatever that might mean, couldn't know all of mathematics because it's unending, it's unbounded. And so if we assume that consciousness is all there is, hypothesis, could be wrong, but if we make that hypothesis, then the only thing for mathematics to be about is consciousness. And that, in Gödel's theorem, then says, well, there's an unbounded range of structures of consciousness, right? It turns out that all conscious experiences are structured. There's a field called psychophysics that I've spent a lot of time in. When we study your experience of color red or the shape of an apple, there's structure in your conscious experiences. So conscious experiences and mathematical structure are not separate things. It's rather that mathematical structure is like the bones of the living organism of conscious experience. So conscious experiences are more than just mathematical structure, but they're not less. And so So the idea is that Gödel's theorem in this context would be suggesting to us that there's an infinite, unbounded exploration that will never, in principle, end of mathematical structure, and therefore of possible varieties of conscious experience. I call that Gödel's candy store. There's an infinite variety of conscious experiences out there to explore, thanks to Gödel. And so that's what consciousness is up to, is the theory that there's an infinite exploration, and we're here exploring. We're doing podcasts. You're exploring ideas. I'm exploring ideas. We're all exploring. A musician writing new music is exploring. An artist doing their painting is exploring. Someone trying to run a 4-minute mile is doing their kind. We're all exploring the infinite varieties of conscious experiences in unique ways. It's not just geeky science. That's not the only way to do it. There's art, humanities, writing books, novels, plays, poetry. There's an infinite variety of ways to explore. And so that's the idea about what consciousness is up to, is this endless exploration. And so to take that idea and make it concrete now, we have to actually write down a dynamics and how does consciousness explore? What does it feel like to explore, right? In some sense, if you're exploring, you have to go into the unknown. If you stick with what you know, you're not exploring. And so you can imagine that there's going to be some fear of going into the unknown. That this idea suggests that it's not going to be. I mean, Gödel's candy store sounds all nice and fun and cheery, and we're kids having more chocolate. That's part of it. Then there's that upside. There is the candy side of it, but there's also to get to the next candy, you got to let go of the candies that you already know and love, and explore something else, and that can be terrifying to let go of what you know. So this point of view does suggest that it's not all fun and games, that in some sense part of what consciousness is up to is learning to let go of what's already known to enable the next step for the joy of the next knowing. So there's going to be a joy and terror cycle in this whole thing. And maybe that's from this point of view, that's the deepest nature of human life and all conscious life is this cycle of enjoying what you know, and then at some point letting go and taking the next step in exploration of Gödel's candy store.
And the language that consciousness is using, from what I'm understanding, is mathematics, numbers.
Well, yes, and since this is for students, let me just say that if any students are interested, want to do research in this area, you cannot learn enough mathematics. I have been in this for many decades. I was spending time just before the podcast learning conformal geometric algebra. So you can't learn enough. So information theory, the things you have to know: linear algebra, geometric algebra, information theory, and then graph information theory, it turns out. And of course, calculus and so forth. In other words, just no end to the mathematics to have the tools that you need. And then tools like neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, if you're interested in making maps to the brain, or physics, if you want to show how consciousness related to the physical world, then quantum field theory. In other words, there's tons of very, very hard math and science to learn to actually make real contributions in this. But it's worth it. And for those who are interested, I highly recommend. But mathematics is absolutely essential. Learn linear algebra first. Learn linear algebra and make sure that you know how to use linear algebra. Then I would recommend something called geometric algebra, which is different from algebraic geometry. Geometric algebra, there's books by Alan MacDonald and Duran and Lassenby on geometric algebra. Very, very powerful language that turns out to be very useful in modeling mathematical structures and their relationship to geometries, which I'm finding is a very, very powerful tool in trying to model consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. So yeah, mathematics is critical. Serious study is critical. Patience is critical. if you're like me, none of this is easy. There are geniuses out there. I know when I was in grad school at MIT, I was around people who were so bright I couldn't figure out how bright they were. So there are people out there that I know, just run circles around me. I have to plod along and just work as hard as I can, and most of us are going to be that way. There are very, very few of us for whom this is easy stuff. So just hang in there and work hard, and you can make a real contribution. But yeah, mathematics is really critical, and then like cognitive neuroscience or physics or chemistry.
It's crazy. It just makes me feel like we are living, as you say, in some sort of a simulation, since everything could be decoded back to consciousness and to numbers. Then what's the difference between us and some very intelligent AI running inside of a computer?
Great question. And a lot of people might say, yeah, what I'm talking about is just the standard simulation hypothesis, that this is all just a computer simulation. So that's a very common theory. I mean, Nick Bostrom is quite famous for proposing it, and other very famous people have said that maybe we're just computer code. Maybe there's a lower level and there's some kid programming there on their computer, and we're just all created by the kid and their software. And then as it turns out, that kid is just a programmed version from a lower level kid program, and it goes all until there's some base level, right? And what's the chance that we're the base level? Zero. So we're probably just simulations, right? And I'm saying something very, very different. That approach is saying that still the base level is a physical world, space and time and particles, and somehow consciousness has to emerge from a really complicated program. Well, that's the hard problem of consciousness. No one has ever figured out how to get a physicalist framework as the base to boot up consciousness. We haven't been able to do it. No one is, and again, I'm not saying that I have a theorem that you can't do it. I'm just saying that I know the players in this game, I know the theories. There's not a single theory that can explain even one specific conscious experience and say this conscious experience must evolve, must come from that particular architecture or that particular software program. And here's the principled reason why. There's nothing on the table. No one can do that. I mean, I've asked the players, they can't do it. I'm not surprised. So that whole simulation approach is assuming that space-time and unconscious matter is fundamental and that somehow programs create consciousness. I'm saying probably impossible to start with unconscious matter and to boot up consciousness. I think it's impossible. And no theory has been able to do it.
You're saying that it has to start from consciousness first and then everything comes from there. My question now is going to be, why do you think that spirituality, psychedelics, and all this culture that seems completely untied to science and to math, they're really talking about this consciousness, and they really do believe that consciousness is fundamental as well? Why do you think they have sort of stuck with that ideology?
Well, it's interesting because mystical spiritual traditions have said things like this for thousands of years, and I think they're onto something, right? They're saying there's more to reality than what you see with your eyes. It's more than just space and time and physical stuff. And when you die, that may not be the end. And so they've been saying that. On the other hand, when you look at where the real progress has come intellectually, it's not really come from that group. It's come from these physicalists who say, no, study space and time and physical objects and write down mathematics and so forth. And that's turned out to be incredible in terms of actually making theories in science and so forth. So we have this meeting, right? On the one side, the people who are saying the spiritual stuff is fundamental, and then the other saying, well, no, we'll just go with atoms in the void, and they make the progress. And so how do we put these together? Well, what's interesting is I think they both have a piece of the puzzle. I think the spiritual, mystical side is right. There's more than just space and time. So they're right about that. But the The hard-nosed side has been largely physicalists. I think that they've been wrong about the physicalism, but they've been right about the methodology of science. Make mathematically precise theories, tell us experiments that we can do to test them that could show you wrong. That's really powerful. And the reason they've had such success, and they've taken the success to show that spirituality must not be fundamental, is because they've only been studying the headset. Because they've been studying the headset, and the headset is not consciousness, it's perfectly fine to ignore consciousness and just study the headset. So that's why they've made tremendous progress. But now we're at this place in human evolution where the two sides need to meet. The scientists themselves are telling us space-time is doomed. We've been studying the headset. They understand that now. We've been studying a headset, and we don't know what's outside the headset. Now, unfortunately, the spiritual side, they have a good intuition about what might be outside the headset, but they haven't had the tools to make that rigorous. So they're telling us the same thing today that they've said 3,000 years ago. Well, for a scientist, if you're saying the same thing now that you said 3,000 years ago, I mean, I don't even want to be dealing with the same stuff that was dealing 30 years ago, much less 3,000 years ago. So you can see why the two sides would be at odds, but we need to lay down our arms. The barriers between us. We need the method of science, the hard-nosed rigor, precise mathematical theories, the humility to propose experiments that could show that you're wrong. In other words, non-dogmatism. Now, individual scientists are dogmatic, but science as a social enterprise is not dogmatic, because you have other scientists try to show that you're wrong. You may not try to show that your own theories are wrong, but other scientists will be happy to show that your theory is wrong. So it's that sense that science is not dogmatic. I mean, individual scientists are. What we need is the social institutional non-dogmatism for the spiritual ideas. And so how do we start? We start humbly by saying, let's propose a mathematical model of consciousness. You go, how could you possibly do that? Consciousness is, you can't put your fingers on it. You can't possibly, it's not possible to do science of consciousness. But just imagine saying the same thing about space 400 years ago. Before we had, how could you possibly put mathematics on space? I mean, you can't even feel it. I mean, how do you put your fingers on space? And yet, we did. Newton put some numbers on it. We have Cartesian coordinates, and we put numbers on it, and we just try it, and it works for a while, and then Einstein comes along and says, no, you didn't quite do it right, and he puts different mathematical structures on it, and we keep doing it. And so that's what we have to do with consciousness. We never make the mistake of saying that the math is the territory, right? If I am building a computer simulation of the weather, you don't need an umbrella when you go into the simulation room. You will not get rain. The simulation does not create rain. And a mathematical theory of consciousness does not create consciousness. It's just a theory. The mathematics isn't the consciousness. So what we need is the two sides to come together. Let's take the intuitions. I think there are good intuitions from the thousands of years of mystical spiritual traditions. We have the powerful tools of science that can help us to make those intuitions precise so that we can see their true power, right? In some sense, the spiritual traditions haven't yet experienced the power that comes from taking your ideas, making them precise, and then letting the mathematics tell you things that you would never have guessed about what you already believed. I mean, just to be concrete, when Einstein wrote down his theory of general relativity, his intuition was, if I'm in an elevator and the elevator starts to fall freely, just fall, then I would all of a sudden become weightless in the elevator. And it turns out that's right. It's a wonderful intuition. It took him 8 years to go from that intuition to the mathematical equation. 8 years of probing in the dark, learning mathematics, trying things, having them not work, pulling his hair out, not being able to sleep at night. It was a really tough 8 years on it. And he was Einstein. He's not a stupid guy like Hoffman. He's Einstein. He's doing this for 8 years. But at the end of it, he got this equation. And then the equation became the teacher. A year later, someone else, Schwarzschild, wrote to Einstein and said, hey, your equation predicts the existence of the structure that we now call a black hole. Einstein didn't know that. He didn't like it. In fact, he disbelieved in black holes for decades. So that's the power of getting your intuitions, which could be deep and right and genius, and putting them in mathematics, because then they come back and teach you. That's what I want to see from the spiritual side. I want to take these ideas that are sitting there, but their real potential, at least this aspect of their potential, has not yet been unleashed. We want our ideas to come back in mathematical form and become our teachers. And so I want science and spirituality to interact, the mathematical rigor and experiments of science with some of the insights of the spiritual traditions. Some will have to go, some are wrong. And that's part of the humble thing. I mean, we have to admit that we're wrong. I mean, Einstein's ideas about space and time were brilliant, but space-time is doomed, right? So even in Einstein, I mean, again, it's not that his work was pointless. Far from it. It was because of the rigor of Einstein's theory of space-time that his own theories are telling us that space-time is doomed. That's the power when your own theory tells you where it stops. Now you've got a real scientific theory.
Well, that's incredible. And to finish off, I love how you sort of tried to combine both the spiritual side and the scientific side, utilizing what works best for both. So my last question would be, what is the legacy that you hope to leave behind in this alternate reality that we're in?
Well, professionally, I would say the legacy would be that we're at this key point in human history. The tools and the attitude of science, the insights of spirituality, they've been at odds. They don't have to be at odds. There is, with rigor and humility from both sides, the two can be put together, and we could get a scientific spirituality that could just be, a powerful engine for our whole race, our whole species, to take the next step in our own exploration. And so, if I can in some way help bring that about, that would be wonderful. So
That's amazing, Don. I really believe that we're getting there. We're seeing scientists study psychedelics, study consciousness a lot, like yourself, and it's been beautiful to see how it's come about. And I wish you the best of luck. Anything you need from my part, I'm here to help also.
thank you, Antonio. It's been a great pleasure.
It's really, really interesting what you're doing. And I'm curious to know if you there are different conscious agents. So a conscious agent, would there be a conscious agent that is God, that just has the most amount of experiences? Have you gotten that far yet, or are you
Well,
still?
it's quite interesting. That's going to be um, a place where I'm going to let the mathematics sort of guide my conclusions, right? Because there I don't trust my intuitions as much, right? But it may be in some versions of this, the the way I think about like Gödel's candy store is it's not infinite, but it's unbounded. So there's no end, but it's not literally infinite, but you can never get to the end. It's always continually growing beyond what you've gotten so far. So if God has to be infinite, then maybe there is no such God of that kind. But if God is the most advanced spirituality, then yeah, then you could use God in that technical sense. Now, what's interesting here is that the word God, right, is not well defined. Right, it's not been well defined, and if you look at spiritual traditions, and that's been right, not a minor problem. Um, we have a history over thousands of years of killing each other because my definition of God is different from your definition of God, and unless you believe my definition, in the tradition I was raised in, for example, you're going to hell. If so my father was a fundamentalist Christian minister, and I remember the attitude, the various denominations within Protestant Christianity. If you were You know, if we say we were a Methodist and you were a Baptist, well, it's not really clear that because you're a Baptist, I'm not sure if you're in or not. I mean, you have to be a Methodist. It was that kind of thing, and so it comes down to some of it's silly, some of it's though just not having a clear definition of what we mean by God, and so I think another thing that could come out of this is the tools to begin to think more precisely what we actually mean by the word God, right? The same way in which the word space and time, right? We all had intuitions about what we meant by space and time, but then Newton came along and they got sharpened up quite a bit. And then Einstein came along and they got sharpened up quite a bit. I mean, none of our intuitions about space and time included black holes or entanglement, but as it turns out, they should. And so the same thing I think is going to happen with the notion of God. We have all of our intuitions about God, just like we had about space and time, but until we get this horsepower, this turbo boost of power that you get from mathematical precision, we're still playing on the shores of exploration. We haven't gotten out into the ocean about exploring what we even mean by the word God. And when we go out there with these tools, we're going to find that there's all sorts of aspects that we hadn't even thought about. And so we've just been piddling on the shore, so to speak. We need to launch out with the boat, some serious tools like that mathematics gives us to actually explore what we might mean by the word God. So the answer is, if it means infinite consciousness, I'm not sure there is such a thing. If it means the largest possible current consciousness that's ever growing and learning, then yes, but now we need to explore what that really means. Well, that's something that we can explore mathematically. And there may be many that are, in some sense, at the same level of power. It's very, very interesting to explore that. If there is if we think of this as an infinite network, then there's a different question. There can be, maybe there is not, maybe now there's a question of, is there one God, or are we going to have many gods? Right? We might have that kind of question. So it's going to depend on the framework. We'll have to choose our framework and see what it leads to, and then see what kind of experiments we can do. In other words, I would like the notion of God to be an experimentally testable notion,
Mm.
a
Or
precise
God
notion.
could be the whole network itself.
Right, where we're trying to write down mathematically what we mean by the whole network and how does that whole network work. In other words, we don't want, unless we can prove that we can't go there. We might be able to prove that there is no way to go further, then we stop, right? If we can prove that we can't go further, then we have to stop. But until then, I think we always have to keep shooting into the dark and looking, shining our lights into the dark and seeing how far further we can go. There may be endogenous limits, and we need to find them.